Hey guys, I'm so excited to introduce our next guest. It's Michael Hyatt, and I actually have his full focus planner here that I love so much that I bought it myself personally. But Michael is just a wizard at how to win at work and how to succeed at life. And he has mentored so many people. And so he is a huge leadership guru. And so we're so excited to have him. Michael, tell listeners a little bit about you if they've been under a rock and they haven't heard about you yet.
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me on. But just a little bit about my story. I spent most of my career in the book publishing industry, most recently as the chairman and the CEO of Thomas Nelson Publishers, which when I became the CEO in 2005, it was the seventh largest publisher in the US, publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. I was involved in taking that company private, and then we sold it to HarperCollins in 2011. And I decided at that point that I was going to pursue my dream of writing and speaking and starting my own company. This was sort of my second attempt to start a company. We can talk about this. But since that time, for the last 3 years in a row, my company's been on the Inc. 5000 list of America's fastest growing private companies. We've grown on average about 60% a year. We're an 8-figure business with 50 employees. And I think probably the amazing thing is, you said it when you introduced me, but we really believe that the hustle fallacy, the idea that you have to do more to get more, is fraught with a lot of problems. And so kind of our motto, our mantra, and the thing that we teach our coaching clients is how to achieve more by doing less. So my own business last year grew by 62%, but I took 162 days off, which meant every weekend and 11 full weeks of vacation. And not only that, but my typical employee works no more than 40 hours a week, because we believe that you need to have a rich life that's outside of your work, and that actually contributes to your ability to scale.
Mm, I love that. So, give us a practical implementation that you have done that you do more by doing less. Like, is there any systems you put in place to kind of allow that to happen?
Yeah, so like one of the best systems, and I only started doing this about 20 years ago, but what I did was I set hard boundaries around my work life. So, before that, what would happen is, I'd get busy during the day. I wouldn't finish my work. So I'd drag it into the evening. I'd go home and I'd have a quick meal with my family. Then I'd crack open my laptop and go right back to work. I'd work through the weekends. My vacations were actually what I would call vacations, where I would go and catch up on email and do all that kind of stuff. So I said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to put a hard boundary around my work so that I'm going to quit every day at 6 p.m. I'm not going to work on the weekends, and I'm not going to work on vacations. Here's what that forced me to do. It forced me to prioritize and make better decisions during the day. So instead of goofing off in the middle of the afternoon, getting involved in a conversation that was kind of trivial, or getting involved in fake work or busy work that really didn't contribute to the vision, I would get focused and say, gosh, what has to be done? Because I'm quitting at 6 p.m. this evening, and I'm quitting. I'm not going to be working this weekend. So I've got to really be productive during work hours. That made all the difference.
Mm, I love that. Well, let's talk about vision for just a second. And obviously, if you are the leader, you really want to be a visionary. But sometimes, depending on what level of leader you are, people just struggle with kind of finding that vision and they flip flop and they start here and then they move here. What are some tips to get leaders to help them to finalize? Here's the vision. Here's where we're going. This is what we're doing, and we're sticking with it.
Well, this is exactly why I wrote my new book, The Vision Driven Leader. And I feel like vision is the single most important thing you can do as a leader. I learned from Stephen Covey, habit number 2 in the 7 Habits book, begin with the end in mind. And if you don't design the future, if you're not clear about the destination, you're still going to get to the future, but you're going to drift into the future in a reactive sort of way, not designed. And no one ever drifted to a destination they would have chosen. You end up in bad places when you drift. When you have clarity around a vision, where it is that you're taking your business or taking your organization, then all of a sudden you can marshal your resources, focus your attention, really get productive and drive execution. But it all starts with that vision. The problem is there are only about 2 books out there on the topic of vision. This is not taught in business school. Most of us haven't served under visionary leaders, so we don't have a clue. We have sort of this vague notion that we need to be visionary, but we've never been taught how. And I think that most of us think, that it's some kind of special charisma or some kind of special clairvoyance, being able to see into the future. And the reason I wrote The Vision Driven Leader is I wanted to help mere mortals, people like us, be able to create a vision, an operational vision for their company that would really drive the activity in their company and make them more successful than they ever dreamed.
Yeah, I love that. And one of my favorite verses is Proverbs 29:18. It says, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." And I think that's so true. And I remember
It is.
one time we were launching a new product, and I was talking about we couldn't figure out which product we were going to do. So we started here, and then we moved over here, and then we moved over here, and we were creating different things. And one girl in the meeting got so frustrated, and she was like, "Well, our vision has changed 3 times now, and this is ridiculous. We need to know which direction we're going. Are we going here? Are we going there? And are we going here?" And that is so true, that we just need, as leaders, to be able to kind of dial it in. But talk about that, because I also think that, one of my favorite sayings is that God can steer a moving ship, but he
Totally.
can't do one that's sitting still. And sometimes you do need to go, okay, we start here, which now leads us to here, which now leads us to here. Can you talk about that because you don't want to feel like, oh, I'm a bad leader because now I'm changing the vision here and now I'm changing it here.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I believe in that too. It's much easier to steer a car or a ship that's moving, but it's also easier to drive and get to your destination if you know where you're going, or at least have a rough estimate of where you're going. You may not know all the particulars initially, but let me give you a story. So back in the year 2000, I achieved this lifelong career goal. I became the publisher of one of Thomas Nelson's 14 divisions, Nelson Books. We published adult trade books. And what I didn't realize when I took that job was that out of 14 divisions, that division was dead last in every significant financial metric. So we were actually shrinking. We weren't growing. We had lost money the previous year. Staff morale was terrible. So the CEO came to me and he said, "How long is it going to take you to turn this division around? Because it's a drag on the entire company." So honestly, I didn't have a clue, but I pulled a number out of the air and I said, "I think it's going to take about 3 years." And he said, "Well, that sounds reasonable. You got it." So the first thing I did was I went off on a retreat and I said, "I've got to get clear on where this is going." And so I took some, my financial statements because I wanted to have a clear sense of where we were. I took the organization chart. I took some other documents to kind of, embrace my current reality and see what it was. And then I just began to dream. I kind of, in my mind, stepped forward 3 years and I said, "What do I see?" And I started writing it down. Now, this is a powerful part of creating a vision because thoughts disentangle themselves, passing over the lips and through pencil tips. So there's something about writing things down that clarifies your thinking. So I wrote things down like this. I said, and I wrote it in the present tense as though it were already happening. So I said, our division publishes 5 New York Times bestsellers per year. Now, we had not had any New York Times bestsellers up until that point, certainly not in the last several years. So then I said also, our staff is maximizing their bonuses because I knew if people had a stake in the outcome, they'd be much more likely to be engaged in the outcome. I also said we were publishing about 120 books a year at that point. And I said, we published 48 books. So my intention was to cut the list, focus our resources, and better ensure the success of the books we had. Now, here's the amazing thing. I went back to the team and I didn't come down like, Moses from Sinai and say, "This is the vision." But instead, what I said was, "Look, I've been thinking a lot about the future. I've written down some thoughts and I really need your help to make it right. I probably missed some things, some other things need tweaked, but I want your help to get this right." And I said this to kind of my inner circle, my direct reports. So they rolled up their sleeves, they fine-tuned it. And in the process, now I transferred the ownership of the vision from me to us because it became their vision. Then we rolled it out to the entire team. Now, here's the amazing part. It didn't take us 3 years to turn that division around. It took us a year and a half, 18 months. We went from number 14 to number 1 in revenue growth. We went from number 14 to number 1 in profit margin, and it stayed that way. That division was the most profitable division of Thomas Nelson Publishers until I left in 2011. So that's the power of getting clarity about what you want.
Yeah, I love that. Now, when you go on your retreats, I've done that a couple times. I don't like to do very many things by myself. I always like to have a team with me. And I've always taken people with me on that retreat. But it sounds like you went by yourself. Are you a fan of kind of doing some things where you go, look, I'm going to go on this retreat myself, kind of hear from God, get some clarity? Or do you do both? Take your team as well?
I think you got to start with yourself. Unfortunately, with the vision, this is not something you can outsource or delegate. And look, I know it's scary. A lot of people feel overwhelmed. But the reason I wrote the Vision Driven Leader was to give you a simple recipe, a step by step path to be able to create a vision. Anybody can do this. I've taken hundreds and hundreds of my coaching clients through this. Anybody can do it. And it's a little scary at first. But the thing about getting by yourself and doing it is you have to figure out what you want. Until you figure out what you want, it's going to be very difficult for you to just sort of to create this by committee. That doesn't really happen. But to figure out what you want, because you're the leader, and if you're a leader, you're leading people somewhere, right? Otherwise, you're just taking a walk with a bunch of friends. But if you're leading people somewhere, which means you've got to know the where. You've got to know the destination, where it is that you're taking people. So I would start with you, get by yourself. And I talk about this in the book, taking just a full day and getting alone with your thoughts and writing them down in a specific format, writing those down and then bringing them back. And then it's the time to involve your team. You definitely want your team involved, but it's got to be in the proper sequence.
Mm, I love that. One of the things I've heard you say that I absolutely love is you say, focus your leadership, focus your team, and grow your business. What are some really practical tips that you can give people? Give us a story where you've seen someone who maybe wasn't focused, and this is what they did to kind of grow into that real focused
Yeah.
leadership.
Well, everybody wants to be focused. Everybody wants to be aligned. Everybody wants to drive execution. Then there's plenty of books on those topics if you go to Amazon, right? But that's where I would say that it still has to start with a vision. And maybe I sound like a one string guitar, but vision is the foundation. Because once you have a vision, now all of a sudden you can focus around that vision. One of the things that happens to entrepreneurs is, first of all, they get overwhelmed. Every entrepreneur I know almost is overwhelmed. They've got too much to do. And the reason why is that once you get successful, you start attracting more opportunities. The problem is that opportunities often come in the form of distractions that are masquerading as opportunities. But without a vision, you don't have a way to discern which is which. And so I had this publishing company. This goes back into the 80s. I started a publishing company. And man, we started with a bang. We published a New York Times bestseller that was on the New York Times list for about 4 months. It created a lot of cash, fueled a lot of opportunities, and then all kinds of opportunities came to us. So my business partner and I decided, hey, we've got an opportunity to do children's books. Let's do that. We've got an opportunity to do gift books. Let's do that. Let's do reference books. We even took on this ginormous Bible project. Here's what that did. We didn't have a vision. So we took on all these opportunities, which proved to be a distraction to us. It fractured our focus. It diffused our resources. And eventually it was our undoing. After 5 years, that business went broke, not because of a lack of opportunity, but because we didn't have a clear way to differentiate opportunities from distractions. So if you want focus, you got to be clear about where you're going. Once you've got the focus, you can create the alignment in your organization, and then you can drive the execution, because execution is everything. But here's the problem. I just read a survey from Gallup last week that on average, the average company, 15% of the people are engaged. Most of them are disengaged. They're going through the motions. They're involved in fake work or busy work, but it's because they're not connected to a story or a meaning that's bigger than their daily work. That's the other value of having a vision. You can get people aligned around it. You can get them engaged in it, because now all of a sudden they realize, we've all heard this story before, they're not just laying bricks, they're building a cathedral. They see the purpose in what they're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I think that Apple is so effective and is
Yeah.
doing so well is because if you think about it, they have one phone. They just keep making that one phone better. So do you have iPhone 8, then iPhone 9, then iPhone 10, and they just have that one iPhone, and they just put all their energy in making that one product amazing. So I want you to talk a little bit about diversification, because, I've heard a saying that, diversify means worsify, right? Like, people want to kind of get into, well, they don't want to be limiting themselves. So that's when they start going, okay, I want to develop this or develop that. Any strategies that you have to kind of decide, okay, do we add this new product or do we add this new line? Or is that going to help increase our business? Or is that just going to be another thing? I call it shiny ball. It's like another shiny ball. And now we're going down this rabbit trail.
Yeah, I think that's where a mission, in distinction from a vision, can be very helpful. So a mission is about now, what we're doing now, and also is very informative when it comes to diversification, what you're going to do. A vision is about then. That's about building the future. So, for example, at our company, at Michael Hyatt and Company, our mission is to help overwhelmed but successful high achievers find the focus they need to win at work and succeed at life. Okay, so that's the thing that informs our day activity. So for us, diversification means what other products can we create that help these overwhelmed but successful high achievers find the focus they need and get the transformation they're after. So, coming up with a clear mission statement that your company, the people in your company can repeat almost from memory is enormously helpful in terms of informing what opportunities you take on, because we get presented with opportunities probably like you do every day, things that we could do, but unless it drives focus, unless it helps our leaders get focused, we're just not interested. We're not going to diversify beyond the mission. The mission gives us kind of the scope of what we can do and what we can't do.
Yeah, I do love Southwest Airlines vision. Theirs is to become the world most loved, most flown, and most profitable airline. And I feel like that's just so clear. Like, we want to be the most loved, we want to be the most flown, and we want to be the most profitable. What are some companies that you say they really have their mission and their vision really dialed in that you can wrap yourself around?
Well, certainly. I mean, you mentioned them already before, but I think Apple is one of the best examples of a company that's got vision. And you think about Steve Jobs, who was an amazing, iconic visionary. I mean, when you think of visionary, he's the guy, right? So, like when he introduced, and you mentioned the iPhone, we got to remember the context of that. Cell phones had proliferated everywhere. The conventional wisdom in the cell phone industry was that there was no room left to innovate. Everything that could be invented had been invented. There were flip phones, there were all kinds of phones out there. But Steve Jobs said he went for sort of the exponential thing, the visionary thing, which is really a part of being visionary is to think not incrementally, but visionary, but exponentially. And so he said, what if we had a phone that has no keypad, or the keypad's a software thing? It has no buttons because your finger is the best stylus ever. And so all that did was work. And I remember initially after he introduced the iPhone, Bill Gates said it was the stupidest, or I'm sorry, Steve Ballmer, who was then running Microsoft, said it was the stupidest idea he'd ever heard. And he gave it a year. He said they will be out of the cell phone business in a year. And boy, was he wrong. Now, the interesting thing about it was there was this guy in the shadows that nobody had ever heard of, a guy by the name of Tim Cook. Tim was really not the leader, but the manager. And you need both in an organization. So this isn't to disparage managers. You need both. Steve was the visionary. He was the leader. Tim was the manager. He was the guy that was optimizing the supply chain, putting into place systems, maximizing profit, all that kind of stuff. But here was the really cool thing is that when Steve died, that wasn't cool, but when Steve died, Tim took over as the CEO, and the tech press said, there's no way that this guy could be successful. He just doesn't have the charisma. He's not Steve Jobs. So we expect the company to diminish over time. Again, they were proven wrong, because vision is not a personality. It's something you take on. It's a skill you can learn. And Tim has done a phenomenal job. In fact, I would argue that he was even more visionary than Steve Jobs. He's tripled the value of the company. He's taken it to new heights that Steve couldn't even imagine, the first $1 trillion market cap company out there. But he has a slightly different view of vision. And you were talking about systems and all that. That's really been his visionary role, to imagine a different way to produce products, a different way to get them to market. That's been his vision and his contribution. And all it's done is work.
Mm. So talk a little bit about what systems and what technology maybe that you have in place, maybe where you are right now, or when you were back at Thomas Nelson, that you have in place that you go, Like, for example, that helps you to avoid the distractions and stay with the vision that you're trying to accomplish?
Well, until you said that last thing, what I was going to say is our hiring process is a system that I think is so critical. I think
Okay.
that this happens so haphazard in so many organizations. One of the major mistakes that I see leaders make when they're trying to run a company is they begin to realize that they need some help, and they say, "What I need is more people like me." No, actually, that's the last thing you need. You do not need a clone. You need people that will complement you, but that are not like you. So we have a very clear hiring process that's very defined. It has 7 steps, which I won't be able to remember all of them, but I can tell you where it starts and I can tell you some key components of it. Number one is getting crystal clear on the job spec, doing a written job description. And in a sense, that's kind of a vision for the job. It starts with imagining the end before you begin. So start with a clear description of what you want, not some vague notion, because that's not going to get you the best person. You got to know exactly what the job's going to require. Second thing we do is we put that out to all of our social media channels. We email blast it. We contact all of our friends because we know the largest pool of candidates will produce the best results. We have a much more likely chance of getting the right fit if we have a lot of candidates to select from. So currently on our site at michaelhyatt.com/careers, we have probably 6 or 7 job openings right now. And for minimum, we'll get 50 applications, sometimes up to 200 applications. So then we go through an automated process. We use a system called Spark Interview, which allows us to automate and interview people via video through a series of questions. And it allows our HR people to scan through those videos, sometimes at 1.5 or 2 times speed, and get through the interviews quickly. So to be able to scan through a large pool of candidates and winnow the field down to a handful. Another thing that we do, another part of the system, is we use the Kolbe, Kolbe, Kolbe Right Fit Assessment. Are you familiar with that?
I don't. I'm very familiar with the DISC score. We use the DISC score a lot, but not
Well,
Colby.
Kolbe, we've used this too. We've used Myers-Briggs, we've used Enneagram, we've used Strength Finders, we've used a lot of different ones, but there's none that's a greater predictor of job success than Kolbe. And here's what they do. They measure something called cognitive energy. So a lot of them measure your intellectual capacity. A lot of them measure your personality. But what Kolbe does is it talks about how you initiate work. So for example, one in their personality profile is the person who's called a fact finder. And those are people that initiate by doing research. So they're going to get on the web, do the research, read the books, whatever. That's how they start a project. There's other people that are high on what's called follow through. And those are people that have to organize the project first. They've got to create an outline or a project plan or a template or something, and they want all their ducks in a row before they start. Then there are people that are quick start. I'm a quick start. We're just kind of sort of ready, fire, aim, get in the game, start, we'll adjust as we go. And those are oftentimes entrepreneurs. So first you take the assessment for yourself. Then you take the assessment. It's another assessment for what you think the job is going to require. And then you administer the test to your candidates. Here's what Kolbe does. It's brilliant. In their Right Fit program, they take all those test results, your test results as a hiring manager, the test results of the candidates, and they give you a letter grade score. So we don't hire anybody that doesn't score for that position at less than a B plus. Every time we thought we could outsmart that, we thought, well, the test is the test. Maybe it's not that smart. We end up failing. We've had some
Wow.
colossal epic failures, but when we follow those results, we're almost guaranteed, it's not 100%, but almost guaranteed that that person is going to find success in their job.
It kind of says, what is their follow through? I would say one of my number one just kind of pet peeves and things that I feel like we just struggle with as an organization is people following through. And so
Right.
I feel like we've got like 2 or 3 people on our staff that can take the ball and take it all the way to the fence. But so, like, for example, with our video team, let's say they created a training video. Like, they're not completing it all the way to the finish line. They're getting it either to the 5-yard line, 3-yard line, the 1-yard line, but they're not, and so sometimes we would have videos that we'd spend hours and hours creating, And then I'm like, well, where is that video? Where is it? Like, is it on the back end? Is it on the team side? Is it organized? Is it put, where people can
Yep.
find it easily? So that would be my biggest, probably kind of frustration that I have. Any tips on getting people in your organization to make it all the way down to that final, even not the 1 yard line, hitting the goal?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things. First of all, when it comes to Colby, you need more people that are high on follow through, right? And not everybody's high on follow through. And in fact, you don't want everybody
Right.
to be high on follow through because you want people, for example, that are high in quick start that can initiate projects. You want people that are research it and make sure that, all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. And you want people that can follow through and pull it into the end zone. Definitely want that. So what that would mean is that as you're constructing your teams, as a leader, you've got to be almost like a symphony conductor. You've got to make sure that you don't just like stack the whole orchestra with oboes or with trumpets. You want a mix of people so that you have the full range of gifts and the way people initiate so that you can complete those projects. I think the other thing too is some organizations have a culture of perfection. Perfectionism is the mother of procrastination. And what I've found is that as the leader, you've got to give people permission to not make it perfect. Okay. So you got to give people permission to say, look, we're going to ship when it's 90% done because we can iterate quickly, particularly in, this environment where there's just in time manufacturing and rapid manufacturing. And of course, if you're in the information business, it's very easy to republish or to update it or make it better. But something is better than nothing. And getting it out there at 90% where you can start getting input from your customers and make it even better. Like you held up the full focus planner. We knew when we shipped the very first version of that it wasn't perfect. No sooner did those books come from the printer. And I was saying to myself, there's about like 10 things that I want to improve. Well, that's fine. This is where you got to take a page from Google. Everything's sort of in perpetual beta. Everything can be improved. Let that rest for version 2.0. So now on the planner, we're at version 4.0. It's an internal designation. It's not something we use with our customers, but there are still things that we want to change. But some of that stuff you won't get clear on until you get it into the marketplace and have real live encounters with real customers with real feedback and get out of the ivory tower of, trying to get it right in the lab. You got to get it out there in the real world.
I agree. I love Craig Rochelle. He has a saying called get mo, and it's good enough to move on. And he talks about how when he's
Love that.
doing his sermon, he can like overcook the sermon because he'll be like, I got to get it done. I got to get it done. And he's like, I can kind of overcook it sometimes. He's like, so I just have to go get mo. It's good enough to move on and go, it is what it is. So let's just talk about any other technology that you've implemented in your company that I love those two tools, the Spark interview and the Colby. I'm going to check into that right away. I haven't even heard of those. But any other technology that you've implemented that has just made your systems better and everything easier and more simple?
Yeah. So about 4 years ago, we were struggling with email and we were using email for internal communication. And we were like pulling our hair out. I mean, everybody hates email. And as a result, people weren't getting back to people in a timely manner. And even when you were, people would respond and then you think, oh, we should have had Joel in that conversation, or we should have had Megan in that conversation. And now how do you get everybody up to speed? So I ran across this tool called Slack. Do you use Slack?
It's funny because we used it for a little while and everyone got on board. Behold, there was like three of us higher leaders that did not get on board with it. And the reason is because we were using Slack and email. And so
Ah,
then it was like a double thing to do. And we couldn't release ourselves from email. But I want to try it again. But if I try it again, we just have to use Slack because otherwise then you're like, oh, now I have to check my email.
right.
And now I have to check my Slack. So if you're going to do it, you have to go all in. And that was what our problem was, is we didn't go all in.
Well, it's been phenomenal for us. We've used it for 4 years. I guarantee it has been a huge driver of our success, why we're so nimble, why we can make fast decisions, why everybody interacts. It's created culture in our organization because we have a lot of remote people. And even when we're working in the same office, so much of your interaction is digital. But here's what we did. When I came across it, and this is how, by the way, this is how I approach almost everything in my company. I treat it like an experiment. So in other words, I'm not suggesting that we adopt this thing and we're going to be committed to it for the rest of our lives, but we're just going to try it as an experiment. If it works, great. If it doesn't, we'll flush it, we'll move on. So I said, okay, I've come across this tool. I knew everybody would be skeptical. As much as they hate email, they were skeptical of another tool. Who wants to learn a new tool? So I said, here's what we're going to do. On Friday of this week, all of our internal communication with each other is going to be via Slack, no email communication except with people outside the company. Slack is our internal communication tool. We're going to try it for one day. And at the end of the day, we're just going to take a vote. So we did it. So everybody got on it. Everybody interacted that day. At the end of the day, people said, we love this. This is amazing. I said, okay, here's what we're going to do now. Now we're going to try it for a week because maybe we just got sort of in the honeymoon phase and we like it because it's new. A lot of us like new stuff. And let's try it for a week and see how it does for a week. At the end of a week, we voted. It was unanimous. Everybody thought it was such a much bigger solution, easy to bring people into conversations, easy to upload files and find them. The search was amazing, all of that. And it's only gotten better in the 4 years that we've been using it. Then we rolled it out for 3 months. We said, okay, let's just check in another 90 days and just make sure. Well, that was 4 years ago, and we still love it. So I think Slack, if you want better internal communication, is a huge positive tool.
I love that. And one of the things that we implemented in our business probably about 4 years ago, because I am such an action taker. People say about me, they're like, I don't know anyone who takes action more than you. So it's great, but it's also a curse because I'm like, boom, I'm like the highest D that you've ever met in your life. I've never even met a higher D than me. And so because I can take action so quickly, one of the things that actually transformed my business from what you just said is I went to Disney World and I went to their leadership plan and it was like a light bulb went off. And what they did, you remember how, I don't know if you've been to Disney World lately, but you know how they have those wristbands
Yeah.
where like everything you can buy with the wristbands? Well, so they said, yeah. So when we implement something, the first thing we do is we tried the wristbands on 10 employees. Then we did it with 20 employees. Then we did it with 100 employees. Then we went to 10 guests and we said, okay, let's try it with these 10. And then they did 100 and then they did it for a whole day. And that really transformed my thinking because I could still take action because I love to move the needle forward.
Yes.
But I was able to allow our company to really grow because the changes were too impactful right away. Can you think of any other things or examples of stories like that where you said, okay, when we're rolling out something, we want it to be easier on everyone so they can kind of adopt that change? Do you have any rollout procedures that kind of really impacted your business?
Yeah. Literally every single product that we do, we roll out like that. We start with a beta group. We think of ourselves, even though we have physical products, even though we have live events, even though we have, a coaching program, everything starts out in beta. And so, for example, when we had the first edition of the Full Focus Planner, we wanted to upgrade it, but now all of a sudden we've got a base of thousands and thousands of users. So we created a private Facebook group and we invited users that wanted to participate and help us with the design of the next one to join that Facebook group. So we had like 10,000 people join that Facebook group. And so every change that we were thinking about, we posted first in that Facebook group. So we're not letting them design it by committee, but we're getting their reaction to the changes we're proposing. And because it's a manufacturing business, if we were to make that widget, that planner, and ship it, and we didn't have, the input from our users, we were risking a revolt. So we put it in there first, and oh my gosh, they caught so many things that we hadn't caught before. Same thing with our coaching program. We now have 500 people in our business accelerator coaching program for business owners and entrepreneurs. And when we started that, we started it with a handful. I started it with a group of 12, and then we graduated from that to a group of about 30, and then we graduated it to a cohort of 50. And now we've got, let me think here for a second, 11 groups of 50. So more than 500 in that group now, but it started small and we proved the concept first before we rolled it out bigger, because that gives us a chance to kind of address the bugs or the problems in the group and fine tune it and make it better before we really roll it out. We've done it with software. We've done it with a number of products.
Awesome. Well, last question. I know that you said you had a lot of remote employees, and I think with leaders, there's so many benefits of remote employees. But what I've heard people say is that I feel like I can't hold people accountable as well when it comes to remote employees, and our culture isn't quite as good. It's harder to do that. So, what are some tips that you've done to kind of really keep the culture, keep everyone bonded, but also have the benefits and talk about some of those benefits of having the remote employees and keeping them accountable?
Well, I've done it every which way. When I was at Thomas Nelson, we had no remote employees. We had other offices around the world, but we had everybody basically in Nashville. The bulk of our employee base was there. When I started my company, Michael Hyatt and Company, it was a virtual company. I had employees all over the country. And one of the things we realized is that we needed a hybrid system, not so much for the accountability. That's a totally different issue, which I'll speak to in just a second. But because people need that human contact, they need the social experience of coming together at work. So what we did was we built our own co-working space. So, WeWork is a big one of those. There's a bunch of them that are out there, but we built our own co-working space. So here's basically our premise, and that is that everybody's welcome to come into the office, but nobody's required to come into the office. So we allow people to manage their own hours. We hold them accountable for the results. This is not a function of being remote or being on site. Because even if they're on site, I mean, are you gonna stand and look over their shoulder? You're gonna have to have an objective measure of their results, whether they're, under your nose or they're 1,000 miles away. And so we do hold people accountable for the results. Get this. In our culture, we have a policy of unlimited PTO. You take off as much time as you need whenever you need it. I was scared to death to implement that policy. I thought to myself, I'm afraid people are going to abuse it. But I found that it was exactly the opposite. If you give people a vision and they're connected to your vision, if they're connected to your core values, if they're connected to your mission, those three items, those make up core ideology. If they're connected to that, they will be engaged. We still have to beg people to take time off because they're so engaged in their work. But here's what it does. When you have a culture like that, and particularly if you have a hybrid kind of location where people can come in or not come in, it gives them a sense of relative autonomy. This is critically important. If you've read Daniel Pink's book, Drive, about what motivates people, one of the three main things that people need to feel, for you to retain them and for them to give their best work is a sense of autonomy. If they feel like, they're just being treated like factory workers, they have to come in and they, have to ask you for permission for every single thing, they don't feel like they don't have ownership. They don't feel like they have autonomy. And you've got to establish that if you want to drive results.
I love it. Well, this has been such a pleasure talking with you. You are amazing. Tell
Thank you.
listeners where they can find you, where they can follow you, and tell them all about your books.
Yeah. So the best place to find the book is visiondrivenleader.com. And if you go there between now and April the 4th, I'm not sure when this is going to air, but we've got a whole bunch of bonuses for you if you buy the book at any retailer and come back with your receipt. So buy it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local retailer, doesn't matter. Bring it back to visiondrivenleader.com. And there's over $600 worth of bonuses, including the audible copy of me reading the book. You get that for free. You get the Kindle version of my last book, Free to Focus. And you get this amazing tool, online tool, and a bunch of other things, some videos and stuff, but a tool called the Vision Scripter tool, which will take you by the hand and walk you through the process of creating a vision for your business. And when you get done with that process, you'll be about 90% complete, good enough to ship, right? So, and everything else for me, you can find at michaelhyatt.com, Hyatt.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And thank you so much for being on the show. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
And you guys stay tuned because we have another episode coming up in just a minute.